Chapter 4, in which I learned that young ladies must not take baths in gentlemen's drinking water. From the time I was 2 years old until about my 6th birthday, nothing startling impressed itself on my baby mind. Ours was just the usual routine of a trading schooner, Seattle to Sydney with lumber, and from Sydney it was bound to the South Sea Islands for copra, loaded with red calico, cheap knives, soap, tinfoil, anything shiny to catch the eyes and thrill the hearts of the natives. We cruised from island to island, picking up half a ton of copra here, a quarter-ton there, until we had filled the hold, and for a deck-load we generally got about 500 bundles of sandalwood. Of course, we took lots of smaller stuff, but copra and sandalwood were our staples from the islands. Copra. The word itself is common to sea travellers, but to landlubbers it is a strange expression found in stories of the South Seas. Copra is the meat of coconuts dried in the sun. The natives break open the nuts and lay them out on woven mats to rot. The rotting process in the tropic heat brings out the oils and acid of the coconut. It takes about 3 months of the drying process to make the copra rotten enough to be ready for market. The natives load it into bales of reeds and carry it off the island in canoes to waiting ships. In appearance, copra is dark brown and fibrous. No copra is first class until it is so putrid that vermin infest it. The stench of it is almost unbearable. In its ripe stage, copra is highly explosive. During the war, many uses were found for the stuff. The waste of its matter was used for ammunition, the oils to preserve foods for the soldiers, and the acids were invaluable in surgery. One of the most common uses of copra is in manufacture of linoleum and some forms of paper. I often wonder, when people are walking on the linoleum in their homes, if they realize that the substance of it came from the savage islands of the South Seas. In trading between the islands, Australia and the States in my early years, our greatest rival and bugbear was the barkentine, Mary Winkelmund, a three-master under the command of Captain Swanson. A barkentine, by reason of its rig, square yards on the foremast, is naturally faster than a schooner, and the Mary Winkelmund for years won every race with the Minnie A. Kane, whether it was from Hawaii to New Zealand or from Samoa to Seattle. My father and Captain Swanson were rivals, both shouting the praise of their ships and in the pride of their navigation, but Swanson had the edge. He would beat us by a few hours, by a few days, and on occasion by 2 months. Father always blamed the bad winds and incompetent sailors, and said that Swanson was afraid to carry as big a load as we were for fear of sinking. But in spite of his alibis, the fact remained that in every nautical endeavour Swanson made us look like a leaking lifeboat in a hurricane. Naturally, to a man of Father's combative temperament, being beaten was bad enough, but Captain Swanson, not content with winning, never let a chance go by to rub in the victory with heavy-handed sea humour. As a result, Father, I believe, would have run his ship on the rocks or jumped overboard himself, if thereby he could have scored on that goddamned square-headed sea-hog, as he always delicately described his rival. How Father did even up the score stuck in my mind because it was combined with the memory of my first attempt at the age of 6 to get rich quick. We were anchored in Double Bay, Sydney, my 6th winter, and Swanson sent word to Father to come aboard the Mary Winkelmund for dinner. Father sent back word that he would accept free grub even on the Winkelmund. I was delighted, for I welcomed an opportunity to get off our own vessel. As we were leaving in a small boat to scull over to the Winkelmund, Father turned to me and said, "Swanson is trying to show off to me what good grub they serve on his packet. I'll paddle you if you dare eat like you enjoy it." When we boarded the Mary Winkelmund by means of a Jacob's ladder thrown over the side, Captain Swanson met us. He showed us around his ship, which was newly painted white from stem to stern. He pointed out the ship's fine points, not forgetting to tell us just where and how much she excelled ours. Father was getting madder and madder all the time, and I was afraid he would blow up and go back without waiting for dinner. "And just to show you how much better and cheaper I manage my ship," concluded Captain Swanson, "look at this." He reached into a barrel and brought out a small piece of something that looked like a dirty marshmallow. "See that, Captain?" he boasted. Well, I had a whole barrel of it. Used it to oil down the masts of this trip. Saved me buying oil. Maybe if you was to oil down the sticks on your ship, you could sail faster." Father took the substance from his hand and smelled it and looked up. I was surprised to see all the mad had gone out of his face. "Got any more of this?" he asked, and there was a twinkle in his eye. "Nah, I ain't got no more. When we struck hot weather, it stunk to high heaven, so I throwed it over the side." "How much have you got left?" Just about a bucketful in this barrel," he answered, "and I told the ship's chandler he could have it. He asked me for it." "The hell you say?" observed my father, and I thought I saw him smile. "You're a smart old barnacle, aren't you, Swanson?" Swanson puffed with pride, and led the way to the dining saloon. There before us was a meal intended to impress Father with its luxuriousness. I looked at it glumly, remembering Father's words, "I'll paddle you if you eat like you enjoy it." How could anybody eat all that food and not show enjoyment? He must have seen what was in my mind, for he slapped me on the shoulder, exclaiming, "Forget it, Joan. Eat all you can and enjoy every bit of it. I'm going to." I had my mouth full before they were in their chairs, but once squared away I never saw Father eat so much or enjoy it so heartily. When he finished, he pushed back his chair, looked at Swanson, and burst out laughing. "What's so funny?" asked Swanson uncomfortably. "Nothing, you big square head. But do you know what that grease is you threw overboard?" "Nah. I found it floating off the Gilbert Islands. Saw some seabirds picking at it, so I put off a boat and investigated. Looked like good grease, so I hauled a couple of barrels aboard and used it like I told you to grease down the masts." "Oh, they're fine sticks, Swanson," grinned Father. "They ought to be greased down with $100,000 worth of ambergris." Swanson gulped and turned pale. His eyes were almost popping out of his head. "Huh? Ambergris?" he gasped. "Yes, ambergris," shouted Father. "Worth $32 an ounce, and you threw a barrel of it overboard. Oh, you threw away a fortune, you goddamned ignorant, stingy squarehead!" And Father lay back in his chair and roared with laughter. Swanson was livid now. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he yelled. "Only don't forget this. There was twice as much stuff there as I took. I know where it is, and I'll go back and get it." "Good luck," laughed Father. "If you can find it again, you're entitled to it." "I'll find it," were the grim parting words of the squarehead captain. Going back in the small boat to our ship, I asked Father what ambergris was. "Whale vomit," he answered. I couldn't see what was so funny about Swanson throwing away whale vomit, so I persisted in questioning further. "What's it good for?" "Joan, ambergris is worth $32 an ounce. He threw away about $60,000 worth just through ignorance." "Well, what's so good of whale vomit? Why is it worth money?" "Perfume companies use it as a base for rare perfume. Oh, and I wish to Christ I could find some." "Why don't you try and find what Captain Swanson left?"
Because anybody but an old fool like Swanson would know that seabirds eat ambergris. What he left is gone long ago. I only hope he does hunt it. It'll keep him off the trade route for 6 months.
And that is exactly what happened. Captain Swanson spent 6 months looking for his ambergris and found nothing. But Father told the story in every port, and nowhere Swanson went did seafolk allow him to forget it. I couldn't forget ambergris either. If Swanson could find it, why couldn't we? There must be some way of locating it. But the more I thought, the more discouraged I became. The whole barrel's full of ambergris in the whole ocean. Not much chance in finding that. Then, like a flash, the idea came to me. It was so simple I wondered why Stitches or Father or some other sea captain had not thought of it. All I had to do was just make the whales in the ocean sick to their stomach, and they would belch forth ambergris enough to fill our ship. That much I figured would be worth millions and millions, and Father would never have to worry about bad trading seasons or port charges any more. We put to sea in a week, and were headed for the Union group of islands about 28 degrees latitude south, 167 degrees longitude west. There ought to be some whales around there. I thought if I poisoned the water in the sea, all the whales would be sick. The only drawback to my scheme was that I didn't have any poison, so I made some of my own. I begged an empty codfish keg from the cook and poured some cold split pea soup in it. I hated split pea soup, so I was sure that it was poison. Then I emptied the spittoon from the wheel, which was full of tobacco juice, and spit into the soup. To this I added tar and some dead rats. The finishing touch was some dead cockroaches. I caught them and mashed them up in the mixture, and then, positive that I had concocted a potion to ruin all the whales, I waited for nightfall. About 10 o'clock that night I slipped to the lee rail and dumped my poison into the sea, and waited. For hours I waited, straining my eyes against the darkness, searching the water for some signs of ambergris to float. At 4 bells I turned in, and spent the rest of my night at my porthole looking for a promise of a sea-sick whale, but of course there was none. My scheme to poison the entire ocean failed, and when the cook found out that I had wasted a pot full of good pea soup, I got a licking for my effort. To this day, the only consolation I have from my failure is that when I detect rare perfume on beautiful ladies, I speculate with pleasure as to what they would think if they knew the base of their scent was whale vomit. As long as I was a baby, the sailors thought me a grand toy to play with and make a fuss over. But when I grew old enough to become a bother, their kindly attitude was frequently subject to change. Of course, it is the common belief that when a captain has a girl aboard ship, that sailors slay each other to get the captain's beautiful daughter, that her very presence on shipboard uplifts them and inspires them to lofty ideals. That might be the case in novels, but in real life it is far more practical. Never in all my experience did any sailor attempt any act of violence to gain my favor. Their acts of violence at times were directed against me instead. It was on our next voyage, after Father's squared accounts with Captain Swanson, that I saw my first real mutiny, and felt what it was like to have an entire ship's crew against one. It all came about in the most natural way from being caught in the doldrums with a short water supply. Our ship carried our fresh water supply in a tank under the fossil head, and in 2 iron tanks lashed on the poop deck just aft of the spanker mast. These tanks contained in all about 5,000 gallons of water, to be used by 16 people over a period of from 80 to 120 days at sea. It was a precious commodity, and it was guarded zealously by the cook, whose job it was to portion it out daily, 3 cups to a person. In the tropics the water became so hot and stagnant that wigglers came out in it. Wigglers are small worms that hatch in the water. It is an old maritime law that every offshore vessel must carry a certain amount of lime juice as a preventative against scurvy. A drop of lime juice in a mug of water kills the wrigglers, and thus enables the consumer to drink water without livestock in it. To this day, old English sailing ships are referred to as lime juicers, and that name came down to them from the old custom. We had been about 83 days from Mukilteo, bound for Brisbane, Australia, with 1,000,000 feet of lumber. The water supply ran very low, and the residue was so alive with tiny wrigglers and germs that it was like a death warrant to drink it. The cook came aft and told Father that a plague would come on the ship from that water. The stench of it was terrible. Even the rats were boldly searching the decks for something fresh. We were in the doldrums, about 11 degrees south of the equator. The ship just wallowed in the glassy sea, and seemed to crack and shrivel in the heat. There was no shade anywhere. The sails hung limp and useless, like unstarched linens. The bedbugs and roaches seemed to multiply by the million. "All hands on deck," ordered my father, and the mate repeated his order to the men sleeping below. In a few minutes the entire crew were on deck. "There's no water, men, until we hit a rain squall. The glass is down, and I look for a squall. So stand by with kegs and catch all the rain you can if you want fresh water." There was a mad hurry to get kegs to catch the rain. The men brought everything from salt pork barrels to empty tomato tins and placed them under the booms and scuppers. The cook and a sailor put a barrel under the drain on the main deck just below the poop deck to catch the water that washed down from the poop. No sailor tried to sleep any more. They sat huddled in the scuppers, looking thirstily at the deceitful clouds that drifted by and disappeared to the horizon with their refreshing cargoes. Night came, and still no sign of rain. Just at sunset, at about a quarter point off the starboard bow, appeared the end of a rainbow, dipping right into the sea and making an arch of vivid colours, which dissolved into the mist of a rain-squall a mile away. It was aggravatingly near, and the men bent every inch of sail to hurry the ship into its mist to catch some of its rain, but just within 100 yards of it the little gust of wind died, and once more the sails hung limp and impotent. That night for dinner we had a sticky mess of salt-dried codfish. Its odour was so bad from the intense heat that the only way it could be swallowed was to smother it with mustard and hold your breath to kill the smell.
"This damn stuff stinks,"
observed the mate, whereupon he proceeded to pick out the remnants of fish from his teeth with the prongs of his fork. I was just old enough to recognize the expression on my father's face as sign of trouble.
"Yeah? Well, any time you get disgruntled about the menu on this packet, just write me a letter and I'll file it in my correspondence."
The mate's remark, however, spoiled his appetite, and he shoved the dish of ill-smelling fish at the cabin boy.
"Chuck that overboard."
For dinner I had my boiled lentils, which only accentuated my thirst, as the salt fish had increased the men's. At sea a very little thing will start a feeling of mutiny, and thirsty, dried-up men, scorched by heat and discouraged by no winds and bad food, are like dynamite to handle. They started to quarrel amongst themselves viciously. Father anticipated trouble. Right after dinner he sent me to buy my bank. Right after dinner he sent me to my bunk.
"And if you hear anything on deck, you stay below,"
he added, and swung up to the poop deck. He searched the horizon for some sign of a storm to bring relief. If another day passed and no fresh water fell, there was no foretelling what uprising would occur. The sky was red, and the old legend, "Red sky at night, sailor's delight," gave no promise that the morning would bring water. Father heard the men mumbling in the scuppers, for in some way they blamed him for their plight. Old Stitches, whose loyalty to father was like iron, came up on the poop deck beside him and casually started to smoke his pipe. Beneath his nonchalance were grim, tight lips. He knew there was going to be trouble, and he wanted father to know that he was still swinging a belaying pin on his side. I could feel something was going on that I didn't understand, and whenever I felt there was something being kept from me, I just had to find out about it. So after I had been sent to bed, I sneaked back on deck and hid out of sight of father. Nobody on ship was asleep. I could hear the men stirring and grumbling forward. Hour after hour passed, and in the deadman's watch, which was from 12 midnight until 4, the men broke. Larson, who had always been one of the best sailors, led the rest of the crew up on the poop deck, seething and snarling.
"What do you want?"
roared my father.
"Water." "And where in the hell will I get water for you?" father asked, as he eyed the men who were closing in on him. "Water!"
came the accusing chorus again. Stitches put down his pipe and edged closer to father.
"The barometer is low. We ought to run into a squall 'fore daybreak," explained father. "Yeah? Well, we want water now, do you hear? And if you don't give us some, you and your goddamn ship will be sucking water in hell."
And with that 2 of the sailors jumped for him, and hit out with terrific blows, the blows of thirst-crazed men. Father hit back, and his punch was like a shot of steel. Stitches struck blindly with the belaying pin. Blood smeared the deck. I could hear the sickening, crunching sounds of bones breaking. Slowly, one by one, the 2 of them backed the cowed men onto the main deck. I scuttled back to my berth and hid myself under my straw mattress. Stitches came below, and I heard him fumbling in the gun rack near my bunk. "Nothing like being watchful in nights like this," he said, and he came back on deck with 2 rifles. For the rest of the night the 2 of them stood off the men on the deck below. Morning came early, for the sun rose at 5:30. I was on the deck early, too uncomfortable to stay below and fretful from thirst. About 6 o'clock, a black cloud, which looked like a splotch of ink on the sky, appeared on the horizon. A light breeze scurried it towards us. In 10 minutes it was upon us, and rain fell in great cool sheets on the swollen decks and the parched lips of the men. They fought each other for their places at the drains to grab the first water. They were like frenzied caged animals suddenly loosed on raw meat as they opened their mouths to let the rain pour in. I stood on the poop deck under the spanker boom, and the water fell on me. It was so cool, so caressing, so life-giving. I couldn't soak enough of it in, it seemed, so I took off my overalls and let it rain on my naked body. I was so absorbed in my freshwater bath that I was oblivious to the men standing on the main deck to catch the water that washed off the poop. I would do my bath upright, a real freshwater bath with soap. Naked and unconscious of the threats of the men who objected to my being in their way, I ran forward to the galley and asked the cook for some soap. He made soap from the grease strippings of the salt pork. To the grease he added lye and kept the conglomeration in a kerosene can under his bunk. I grabbed a handful of it and began smearing it on me as I ran aft once more, and up to my place under the spanker boom. I was a mass of sticky bubbles, and the rain carried them, after they washed me off, down the drain into the waiting kegs of the crew. The soap suds ruined their water. 2 of them leaped up on the deck by me and were about to choke me when my father interfered. He grabbed me by my slippery body and put me behind him, while he ordered the men down on deck. Then he turned to me.
"What the hell's the big idea?"
he yelled, so enraged with me he was pale.
"It feels so goddamn good to get cool in the fresh rain,"
I answered. The humor of my remark didn't appeal to him. I could see I was going to get another licking, and my bare body was a good target for a rope's end.
"I'll teach you to spoil fresh water,"
he said, and he went forward, and he returned with a handful of the soap.
"Now open your mouth. You're so anxious to be washed clean, just taste that."
And he washed the inside of my mouth with the rotten soap. And I've never wanted to be washed clean since then.